Hi there, my name is Corry.
And my name is Sasha Luccioni. Today we'll be presenting a paper co-authored with Hamsini, Sridharan, Mike Ananny, Jason Schultz, and Kate Crawford entitled The Framework for Deprecating Datasets, Standardizing Documentation, Identification, and Communication.
This paper was conceptualized and written as part of Knowing Machines, a research project led by Kate Crawford, Mike Ananny, and Jason Schultz, which aims to trace the histories, practices, and politics of how machine learning systems are trained to interpret the world. And this group and this work that we'll be presenting today has been supported generously by the Sloan Foundation. So this paper begins with the premise that training data sets are central to machine learning models and their impact in the world. It observes that the machine learning community has recently made significant headway in realizing both the critical impact of training data as it exists technically and socially, and therefore has improved documentation practices for data sets across the model development lifecycle. However, there's a phase of the model development lifecycle that has received much less attention, and that is dataset deprecation, or the end of life phase in a model lifecycle. So despite not receiving concerted attention, practices of dataset deprecation can have significant downstream effects and thus require both critical thought and some constructive wayfinding that we attempt to offer in this paper. So in turn, in this paper, we address dataset deprecation in machine learning. And in what follows, we'll cover some related literature, we'll identify several cases of datasets that continue to circulate despite having been deprecated, and then describe different technical, legal, ethical, social, and organizational reasons that datasets may need to be deprecated. We then propose a dataset deprecation framework with 3 elements: a deprecation report, a system of permanent identifiers, and a centralized repository for managing deprecation. And then we'll conclude with a discussion of how our proposed framework can help ensure proper deprecation. So the development of the dataset deprecation framework draws from 3 central nodes of scholarly literature. First, it builds off of recent work in machine learning that has argued that datasets are an important, but often an undervalued and under-scrutinized part of ML systems. It also builds off of approaches from science and technology studies that have focused on responsibility for socio-technical systems over time, especially during phases of maintenance and repair and breakdown. And finally, it also draws on or connects this literature to feminist political philosophies of care. So the framework we propose is inspired by and builds on these literatures in arguing that dataset maintenance can be considered a care practice. That is, a dataset's life cycle is a value-inflected social process that depends significantly upon the motivations and the decisions and the actions of dataset creators. So in understanding dataset maintenance as a care practice, we don't simply ask those who interact with datasets to care more, but rather we try to provide a scaffolding through which care practice can be enacted at a dataset's end of life. So to illustrate the general lack of deprecation practices within machine learning context, we first studied several major machine learning datasets that have gone under either partial or wholesale deprecation to show the need for a common framework to guide and structure these practices, especially given the potential harms and errors that can come from deprecated datasets' continued circulation and use. So reviewing these deprecations, we made observations about 6 central concerns. And I'm only going to go through a few of them because of time. So first, there was inconsistent public notice and transparency regarding rationale for withdrawal. So while some dataset creators gave public notice of deprecation, others gave sort of obfuscatory responses or gave no explanation at all for why a dataset was removed. There was a lack of explicit instruction not to use deprecated datasets. And there was the continued circulation of datasets despite them having been deprecated or deleted. So they often continue to circulate, continue to be used to train models, and continue even to be cited in scholarly research, and one would assume also be used in industry contexts years after a data set was ostensibly deprecated. Some other ones that we address in the paper. So this analysis in sum shows that the process of deprecation varies greatly. There's little consistency among what triggers deprecation, how removals are publicized, and how many of the technical details of deprecation are even made visible or made transparent. So while this analysis shows that the process of deprecation has had little consistency and little transparency, dataset deprecation is actually a necessary part of the machine learning lifecycle of creating and maintaining and eventually sunsetting datasets. So there are, in fact, technical, legal, social, and organizational considerations that might call for a dataset to be deprecated. And understanding these considerations kind of helps further show the need for a consistent framework for deprecation within machine learning contexts. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of some reasons that data sets might need to be deprecated. For one, there are technical reasons. A data set always represents a sample from a particular time and a particular context. And that means that data sets are subject to drift, meaning that they might not accurately describe what they're trying to model over time and therefore might need to be deprecated. There are also legal reasons that a data set might need to be deprecated. So data sets can potentially violate diverse laws, whether privacy, discrimination, data protection, intellectual property, among others, that require the removal of training data. There are important social reasons as well. So critical work examining data sets has shown that training data can reproduce both allocative and representational harms. And the continued circulation of data sets after their ostensible deprecation can both continue and intensify these problems because no one can claim responsibility for these data sets any longer. And finally, there are organizational reasons. So organizational changes, whether changes in a team, changes in the amount of resources that an organization has, might require the removal of data. But faulty deprecation can have downstream effects for organizations. For instance, if data continues to circulate, there can be security problems, and therefore that can have consequences for reputation of organizations. So all of these are reasons that data sets have and will continue to be deprecated, and they really show the need for a consistent data set deprecation framework that my colleague Sasha will describe.
What we propose is a dataset deprecation framework. It's got three elements: the dataset deprecation report with information about the dataset and why it's being deprecated, a unique dataset identifier to make sure that it's easy to track datasets in different versions and across time, and a centralized repository for hosting dataset deprecation reports and consulting them. So the dataset deprecation report, this is really the center of our proposal. It's got 6 elements. Reasons for deprecation, so explaining the potential impacts of the deprecation of a given dataset, detailing the risks and the impacted communities. The execution and mitigation plan of how the deprecation will happen, how access to the dataset will be restricted across its different versions or the different places where it's hosted. Appeal mechanisms, so what's the mechanism to contact a person responsible for the appeal process and how it's possible to submit an appeal if you don't agree with the deprecation. A timeline to transmit the information to the community and receive appeals. A post-deprecation protocol that talks about the methods for sequestering and accessing the dataset after it's been deprecated. So for example, if someone wants to audit the dataset or analyze the dataset, what are the procedures in place to grant access to deprecated datasets, and in what cases will the permission be granted? And finally, a publication check. So submitting to conferences and to journals to check that the submissions don't use the deprecated datasets, or if they do, that they submit their permission for using them. So for example, we've created a fictional dataset called Face Fields that was created by scraping images off the internet, 6 million images off the internet, and labeling them with the emotions that are perceived by the labelers on the image. And so after significant backlash, the company that created it decided to deprecate it. And here's an example of the deprecation report that they could submit to accompany the deprecation. So we have the reasons for deprecation. We have deprecated the face field dataset due to issues raised in the original context for scraping the photographs, methodological concerns about the possibility that you can, in fact, universally recognize emotions, and the potential harm for downstream implementations. We recognize that removing the dataset will potentially have commercial and scholarly impacts. However, we feel that the risks outweigh any potential benefits. This is important because removing any dataset will definitely have impacts on applications, both in academia and in industry. Execution and mitigation plan. We have attempted to contact all stakeholders who applied to download the dataset via email to request that they no longer use it. We have sent them this protocol and provided them with a single point of contact within the lab who can answer their questions. We have located copies of the dataset on other repositories and emailed their administrators, linking the deprecation report. Appeal mechanisms. Appeal will only be allowed in limited cases with a strong justification. We will evaluate the appeal within 15 days of receipt, communicate our decision via email, and publicly update the protocol if there are any changes made that affect all stakeholders. Timeline. The dataset will be removed after 30 days of the public announcement to deprecate it from our site, and ideally from all repositories, assuming that they agree to our request. Of course, it's hard to control external hosting of the dataset, but the efforts have been made here. Post-deprecation protocol, our lab will retain a complete copy of the face field dataset, that's deprecated dataset. It will not be available publicly or to researchers without approved access. Access will only be given to researchers who are doing analysis and auditing work, such as understanding how the dataset is impacting production level systems. Researchers can apply this at this email address, and they must stipulate a research rationale, use strict access protocols, and agree to our terms of access and timeline for use. So, right, if people do want to use this later on, not for training, but for auditing, then it's possible given certain conditions are met. Publication check, we asked all researchers to stop using the face field dataset other than researchers who have been given post-deprecation approval. Researchers submitting conference papers or journal papers that use the face field dataset with approval should include with their submissions a copy of the post-deprecation protocol. And so the second part of our proposal is a DOI identifier, which we have not invented, that has been around since 2000, that was created by the ISO as a way to standardize and track the creation and evolution of digital objects, right? Because there's so much evolution going on and they change quite a lot. And so DOIs are fixed, so the identifier itself is fixed, but they are bound to metadata that can be changed and updated. So this can be the URL, the version, the title, et cetera, et cetera. So this is important because even if data sets are deprecated, you can keep the DOI and update the status, update the URL, update the information, et cetera. So it really helps identify the status of data sets and the information. DOIs have actually been used for lots of digital objects, for example, articles and even figures sometimes, but in terms of machine learning data sets, it's been limited. So Showerman et al. In 2021 actually found that from the data set that they looked at in computer vision, only around 3% used DOIs. So most were hosted on GitHub, and kind of the information was not a static, was not like a unique identifier. Actually leveraging DOIs in the machine learning community can help it easier to find data sets. For example, if several have the same name, to determine their status, to determine what version is the most updated one. So it would be useful to have like a single identifier you can use for figuring out the data set and where it's at. The final item in our framework is a centralized repository to store, to update, to disseminate dataset deprecation reports, to provide researchers with a single site to check to see if they should be using a dataset or not, if it's been deprecated. It can also help doing publication checks for conferences and journals. So if ever they get a submission, they can check the status of a data set, or if a new version is available and should be used. And so it's really like a centralized place for hosting all this information. It also would allow researchers to submit dataset deprecation reports that can be viewed by their community, to notify the community when a deprecation is necessary and why this is the case. And so it would really help fluidify this whole process and make the communication much more centralized and accessible. And this could be hosted either by a conference or an entity, a communal entity within the community that can do this kind of maintenance and dissemination role. So as a conclusion, dataset deprecation is important. It's an important part of the dataset lifecycle, but it hasn't really received sufficient information from the machine learning community.
We've proposed our dataset deprecation framework, informed by a review of several major datasets that have been redacted or deprecated. And we hope that the framework, alongside other dataset care practices like data sheets, checklists, and audits, will provide a way for ML communities to practice responsible and ethical data management throughout a dataset's lifecycle. So thank you for your attention, and we really look forward to hearing your questions.